The Boston Jewish Film Festival is celebrating its 30th anniversary with a retrospective series starting this Sunday. To tell us about the lineup and the cause for celebration is the festival's executive director, Jaymie Saks. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank
Jaymie.
you, Chris. It's great to be here.
Happy 30th.
Thank you.
And what got this all going?
That's a great question. The festival was actually started by a woman named Mikkel Goldman. She moved here from San Francisco. San Francisco has the oldest Jewish film festival in the country. And she felt that there were films that she had seen out there, particularly films from Israel, that were not being seen. And at that time, if you think about the late 80s, there was no way to see these films. And so she started it just like you would think, with a weekend actually here at Boston University in Sherman Union for one weekend, and it's grown from there.
So I imagine one of the draws here is you get to see films that you probably wouldn't see in a standard theater, but they're not all Israeli films we're talking about, right?
That's true. Today we show films from around the world. Typically there's 15, 16 countries represented, and some of them do end up in theaters, but most of them do not. Some of them do end up streaming online now. We certainly didn't have that in the 80s. Some of them do not, but most of them actually do not, and it's still really the only place to see these films.
And I have to, I mean, there was one that I saw a couple of decades at least in the past. It was shot at Doyle's in Jamaica Plain.
Yep. They're shot all over the world, and we always have things from here in Boston as well.
Yeah, but when you have films like this, that you have local settings, we're talking about encouraging people to create things too. Isn't that one of the purposes?
You're absolutely right. And one piece of that we now do every year is a short film competition, where these are young filmmakers making their first films who come. We have a big event. They get to speak about their film. We have a vote. Everyone goes out for a beer. And it's a great way to encourage young filmmakers, and that's really the idea behind it.
And I guess without a festival like this, a lot of people, they would never think of making this kind of film because they'd be saying to themselves, well, who's going to look at it, right?
Exactly. And they know that there are actually now Jewish film festivals around the country, and so they know they'll have an audience for it.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Jaymie Saks about the Boston Jewish Film Festival's retrospective. Retrospective means you're looking at films people have seen before. How far back do these go?
These go back to the early 2000s, so about 15 of our 30 years. These are really first of all, the most requested films, the films that have really stuck in people's minds, that people continue to talk about and continue to request to see again.
I think, if you showed these films 10 or 15 years ago, they made an impression at that time. We're seeing them later. I think a lot of things seem to have changed. Talk about that film that's set in the middle school in Tennessee, the Holocaust Learning Project.
Sure. So this takes place in Tennessee, in a town that doesn't have very many Jews. Most of them have never met a Jewish person. It's a middle school, and they're thinking about how to teach the kids about the Holocaust, about the enormity of the Holocaust, what 6 million really means. And they start a project to collect paper clips from representing the 6 million. Of course, this is before social media, so they do it by postcards and advertisements and all kinds of things, and word spreads, and from all over the world they receive shipments of paper clips. Some classrooms gather them, some people send one paper clip. They come from all over the world, and being able to sort of put them all together in one place, if you can imagine 6 million paper clips, really, I think, makes an impression to kids of the enormity of the tragedy. They actually end up getting a boxcar, a rail boxcar that was used at the time, of course, to transport Jews during that time. It's on the school campus. It's still there, and it's filled up. You can see how high it comes, how high 6 million paper clips takes up. And I think for kids with no other connection to this, it's a really tactile way for them to experience what 6 million really looks like. They developed a curriculum. The curriculum is now being taught across the country. We're going to have, actually, as our guest, a teacher in the school who was a middle school student at that time. She now teaches this curriculum to the kids in that school.
And of course, we have the Facing History curriculum around the Boston area.
Yeah.
And it just makes me think here, this is not just a film for people of one persuasion. I mean, this is a film where you look at the Holocaust and then you sort of transplant that narrative to a whole lot of other situations.
Exactly, and I think it's becoming more and more important that people outside the Jewish community understand the Holocaust, and it's being taught less and less. So it's really important that we find ways to teach it in ways that kids can relate to it.
Another historical narrative is about these pilots who were in the U.S. military
Yes.
and after World War II,
Yes.
they take part in the War of Independence for Israel.
Yes, and this is a great story of how these American pilots, as you said, it was if you think of 1948, right after World War II, you had these flyboy pilots who were a little cocky, a little risk-taking, and were asked if they wanted to go over and fly planes for Israel. And they said, sure, what a great adventure. So they went. And they really constituted Israel's first Air Force in the War of Independence in 1948. Israel is celebrating now its 70th anniversary from that war, and from declaring its own independence. And so it's a it's a great story to be telling now, listening to these people talk about how they kind of went over there because they thought it would be fun, and they really ended up making a difference in history.
What intrigued me, this is more than just a war story and heroes and planes. These are people who are they're going through this whole transition in terms of their Jewish identity and their desire to assimilate in the United States too.
Right, and they sort of were different. They each tell their own story, and they were, I would say, Jewishly connected at different levels. Some of them were very Jewishly connected, some of them were not. And then sort of how it impacted them after the fact. One of them stayed in Israel and ended up living there, and so it really, I think, connected them, of course, very tightly to the Jewish state.
Another film here is about another kind of immigration story, and again, every country in the world seems to be struggling with this these days. In Israel, immigration from many different parts of the world, different cultures, and there's a racial divide that people are struggling with.
Mm-hmm. There is today, yes, immigrants from Africa.
And how is that told in the film that's part of this retrospective?
So the film was made in the early 2000s, and for about 20, 30 years before that, Israel had been airlifting Jews from Ethiopia. There's actually a big community of Jews in Ethiopia that were being very mistreated by their government, and so Israel took them in. And for 20, 30 years had these sort of airlifts that came from Ethiopia to Israel, and Israel absorbed them as Jewish immigrants. And this story takes place during that time. It was made in the early 2000s, so you had kind of a generation that had grown up in Israel. When the Ethiopians got to Israel, they did face some racism. They faced some rabbis who didn't believe they were really Jews, and so now you had 20, 30 years later this generation of young filmmakers, of Ethiopian descent but native born in Israel, who were telling that story, and that's very much what this story is about. Fast forward now 15 years, and Israel has really pretty much absorbed all the Ethiopian Jews, but there's now a whole other immigration issue taking place with non-Jewish African immigrants who have made their way to Israel, and Israel as a society is dealing with how they, if and how they should be absorbed, very much in the same way that America struggles with its immigrants and what we should be doing.
There is another film in the lineup here about a man in Mossad, the security forces, hunting down the ex-Nazi, and what happens next?
So this is a fun but also very powerful film, and you're right, it's about a young Mossad agent played by the actor Lior Ashkenazi, who is one of Israel's most popular actors and has been in many, many films before that and since then. And he plays a Mossad agent who has just lost his wife, and he's assigned to track down an elderly Nazi living in Germany. And to do that, they say, this German guy's kids, one of them is living here in Israel on a kibbutz, and the other one's coming to visit. Why don't you go make friends with them? And so he does. And at first, he's rolling his eyes, going, what do these kids know about anything? And they, of course, don't know that he's Mossad. They think he's their tour guide. But over time, he gets to know them. I don't want to give too much of the story away, but I think he really begins to think about friendships and relationships, and the killing instinct, and sort of what his morals really are. This film was made at a time in the early 2000s when, and Israel always has had to think about its relationship to Germany and its relationship to World War II, of course. Today, there are 30,000 Israelis living in Berlin. That would have been unthinkable 15, 20 years ago. So this film, I think, was really kind of represents the thinking 15, 20 years ago about how Israel relates to Germany, how young Israelis relate to young Germans, and sort of the relationship between the two countries and how they struggle with the past.
And we should mention, this is going to start on Sunday, and it's going to go for a few days longer after that?
Yes, it starts on Sunday, runs through Wednesday. All the films are at West Newton Cinema. There are tickets available at the door or, of course, on our website, bjff.org.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Jaymie Saks from the Boston Jewish Film Festival.